Thank you for joining. Sorry, Natasha.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Leading in Turbulent Times Managing Change webinar. My name is Natasha and I'm an events coordinator at CMI. I'll shortly be handing over to our speakers for the day. Denise Skinner, Chair of the CMI East Midlands and Eastern Regional Board, and Euan Blair, Co-founder and CEO of WhiteHat. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can ask them using the live chat box to the right of your screen, and we'll answer as many as we can during the session. You can also share your own tips and network with others that have joined us. Today's session is being recorded and it will be shared with you later on today. Now over to Denise Skinner, Chair of CMI East Midlands and Eastern Regional Board.
Thank you, Natasha. Apologies, everybody. I was so keen to get going. I leapt in there before Natasha had a chance to introduce us. So starting again, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm delighted you're able to be with us. As Natasha said, I'm Denise Skinner. I'm the chair for the CMI East Midlands and Eastern Regional Board, and I'm also a companion of the CMI. I'm joined today by Euan Blair, co-founder and CEO of WhiteHat. Hi, Euan. Perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about WhiteHat before we begin.
Sounds good. Hi. Great to, I guess I can't see anyone, but good to be here virtually for this. So first on WhiteHat, for those of you who don't know us, we are the 4th fastest growing startup in Europe, and we are on a mission to create a diverse group of future leaders by building an outstanding alternative to university through apprenticeships. And WhiteHat basically exists because university is broken as a one-size-fits-all model. Traditional universities are still teaching people the way they were a century ago, despite huge changes we're witnessing in the labour market. And they're also failing to meet the challenge on improving social mobility. So half of those on grad programs were educated at private school, as an example. Employers need skills as well as knowledge, particularly in areas like digital, tech, project management, and grads aren't being given these skills. So we focus on 3 areas. First, give employers a way of measuring potential that's not just based on work experience or academics. Second is training people through applied learning, teaching them to problem solve. We do a lot of this with our partners at the CMI. And finally, giving our apprentices access to this really great social and networking experience. Meetups, sports teams, societies, so they're not missing out. And our apprentices work at some of the world's top companies, Google, Facebook, Sky, Bloomberg, Omnicom, Visa, Clifford Chance, all without having a university degree. And then we're increasingly focusing on reskilling people who need support in areas from management training through to data analytics.
Thank you, Euan. So what are we going to cover today? Firstly, what I want to do is outline the content of the presentation, and then we'll get really stuck into the meat of it. So what I want to look at today is managing change in turbulent times, which I think we're all experiencing. But I don't want to focus just on the current pandemic. I want to think of it in a broader sense. So in the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to cover a lot of different things, which I hope will be useful for managers and provide some food for thought. As individuals, we've all experienced changes, big and small. Some went well, some not so much. And I suspect some, if not all, of what we're going to cover today is going to have resonance with your own experiences. So I want to share some insights into managing change with a particular focus on leading people through change. The topics we're going to cover are on the slide that's in front of you. So I'm going to take you through some of the models and key ideas, highlighting aspects that I think are particularly important. At the end of that part of the presentation, I'm going to ask Euan to share his perspective as a CEO, and I have some questions lined up that I want to put to Euan, and to get him to give us his thoughts about leadership during change. We're then going to try and answer some of your questions. So there are 3 key things which underpin the thinking reflected in this webinar. Firstly, change is difficult, and it always has been. Machiavelli said this in the 16th century, but I reckon that the difficulties were apparent long before that, and to be honest, it hasn't changed. Secondly, for all organisations, regardless of size, sector, and whatever type of activity they're involved in, change is ongoing and inevitable if the organisations and the individuals within them are to thrive over time. Thirdly, for organisational change to happen, the individuals within the organisation are going to have to change what they do and how they do it. Therefore, people have got to be key to successful change. The last 2 points alone make leading or managing change an inevitable part of every leader's or manager's role. So the prompt to change can come from a variety of sources, and common reasons for change are listed on this slide. It may be one earth-shaking event, such as a global pandemic. It can stem from the actions of those external to the organisation, perhaps a change in legislation. Or it can be the result of the everyday actions of people within the organisation as they respond to the daily needs of their customers, the systems, the services they provide. Or it can be a mix of these things. But if you're leading change, it's crucial you know why the change is necessary, and you can explain that convincingly for people. Inevitably, the different reasons for change mean that change can take different forms, and the timescale in which it needs to happen can vary enormously. If you look at the models and theories, you'll note that they use a variety of terms to differentiate between the types of change. And I've grouped them together on this slide here as a way of just illustrating the commonalities, because there are common themes, albeit the variations in labelling that is used and the timescales which are referred to. So you regularly see change referred to as adaptive or transformative, incremental or radical. Adaptive and incremental tend to be similar. The change is generally involving small steps or tweaks, whereas transformative and radical are a significant, far-reaching change. Change can be emergent or planned. Emergent change is continuous. It's not planned, it's unpredictable, as practices and behaviours change in real time in response to changing conditions. Planned change, however, is intentional and is generally a process that's been put in place by the organisation that's in response to having identified an area where change is needed. Change can be bottom up or top down, or perhaps a mix of the two. Quite deliberately on this slide, I've lined up adaptive, incremental and emergent with bottom-up change, because bottom-up is often more about current practice influencing how things are done in the future. This is often change people make as part of doing their job, responding to customers or requests or demands from the services they provide, or identifying a better way of doing something and being able to change it because they can control and influence what's happening. Top down is as it sounds, it's imposed from the top, and it can be seen as something that's being done to us. It can be a common response to a crisis if the perception at the top of the organisation is that something needs to change in a particular way and at a particular speed. Change also occurs at different levels. It can be across all organisations, such as the requirements relating to COVID-19. It can be sector-wide, organisation-wide, or happen in particular departments or teams within organisations. And it may well happen across several levels at once. Because successful change matters to organisations and the people within them because successful change matters to organisations and the people within them, managing change is a topic that attracts a lot of attention. And there's an awful lot that's been written about it. If you've done any type of study that looked at change management, you'll be aware that there are a great many theories and models of how to manage change out there, and a lot of people telling you how to do it. There's also a lot of people who will insist that there's one right way. However, a quick trawl of the internet throws up more than 40 models that are referred to by multiple sources. And what's apparent is that there are a number that are widely referred to, but even with them, the prominence of each model does vary over time. So things do to some extent go in and out of fashion. The models I'll talk about today are among those most commonly used. And for the purposes of this presentation, they're models which usefully highlight what I think are some of the key issues to consider when you're leading a change. So the first one I want to show you is Lewin's force field analysis. Now, Kurt Lewin is a seminal name in the context of change management, and his force field analysis is a useful tool, identifying not only the drivers for change, but also the obstacles and the relative strength of these forces in achieving the desired change. The underlying principle here is that the forces must outweigh the driving forces must outweigh resisting forces if the change is to happen. Otherwise, the status quo remains. So a typical force field diagram shown here is composed of a line or block which represents the proposed change, two sets of arrows on either side of the line or block, the arrows representing forces driving the need for change, and the arrows representing forces that will be resistant to change. The arrows are usually numbered or lettered to match users' listings of factors that will drive or be resistant to change. The length and the width of the arrows shows the relative strength of whichever forces they represent. So I've put some examples in here just for illustration. It can be a useful way of identifying and setting out key forces for and against change in a given situation. And capturing it in this way makes the situation clearer, it stimulates discussion, and it stimulates thought. So it's a useful tool for considering how the forces for change might be intensified, or resistant forces might be weakened or reduced. And surprisingly then, the force field analysis is often used to support decision-making when changes are being planned or implemented. However, there is a tendency to look at this analysis from a high-level perspective and as something which represents the whole change process. In reality, the force field analysis might look very different depending where you are in the organisation and in relation to how that change is going to impact on you and the team you work with. The construction and comparison of multiple force field analyses to identify differences can be really helpful in engaging people with the planned change at an early stage. Another big name in change management is John Kotter, a Harvard Business School professor who's been a very influential contributor to the thinking about leading change. Kotter devised an 8-step program, which you can see here, for making change happen in organizations. And this is widely promoted. It's one of the ones you can find most easily when you start looking at change management. And it's used in lots of business schools. One of the important aspects of this model that you'll notice is that it does recognize the centrality of people in successful change. So for example, the first step, it's about pushing people out of their comfort zone and making clear to them the need for change. The next step requires you to build a team of people to guide the change. And I think the important part to remember here is that this shouldn't necessarily just be senior management, although senior management support is really important. A team needs to be a mix of people from different levels and parts of the business. The reality is that people with influence can be found throughout an organization, and they don't necessarily have leader or manager in their title. The third step requires you to create a vision. This is what change is going to do for us. It's going to draw together the plans and proposals and identify what success will look like, including what the measures of success will be. And it's important to identify what the measures are early on. It helps you make the vision concrete, but it also helps you track what's happening. In the next step, the vision needs to be consistently communicated over time, not just in a one-off presentation. And this is a theme that we'll return to. It's very important in step 5 to make sure there are no obstacles preventing employees from implementing the vision. This could refer to training needs or resource needs or something else. Step 6 highlights the importance of making sure that some positive outcomes of the change program are visible early on. Sharing early wins is important. It provides encouragement and reinforces the belief that the change can be successful. Step 7 follows this up by suggesting you use short-term wins to maintain momentum and enthusiasm and ensure that the greater change, the big picture, is going to be achieved. And in step 8, the change has happened, you've assessed it, you know where you are, and you have to take action to make sure that the change is embedded. And so you continue in the way that you intended. Now, you might not agree with the order of the steps or feel that they cover everything. The model doesn't, for example, include any feedback loops. But you will have noticed that the focus here is on the actions that leaders can take to create enthusiasm for the change and to gain people's engagement with the necessary actions. It is a top-down model. It is from a leadership perspective, and the model does assume acceptance of the change. It could also be seen as implying that change is a linear process. However, in reality, Change is often not a linear process, nor is it always accepted. In my experience, change can feel far more messy, a little bit like this heap of whatever it is on the floor. And perhaps, like the board game Snakes and Ladders, it sometimes feels like we make progress, we go up the ladder, only to slide back down the snake later on. While this can be disheartening, I think it's normal. Change processes are perhaps more like a series of linked circles, where you can progress from one cycle of activity to the next, but equally you may need to revisit a previous cycle more than once. As reflected in Kotter's model, the people involved in the change are core to its success or failure. And so we need to recognise that change requires people to move out of their comfort zones, to change their behaviour. It may challenge their norms. It may necessitate them thinking differently and acting differently. Unsurprisingly then, change isn't comfortable for most people. And contrary to what Kotter's model implies, there will be those who are reluctant or who resist. This is a natural and normal human response to change. So it's important to remember during any change that people always have choices. And they may not be the ones they particularly like, but nonetheless they do exist. They can accept change, but the way they accept change may differ. It could be enthusiastically, it could be grudgingly, or it could be with ambivalence. They can choose to leave. The individual may choose to leave the organisation if the perceived change no longer fits with their values or their own career aspirations. And this may have a cost if they are staff your organisation can't afford to lose. Or they can resist. People don't always have the choice to leave an organisation, even if they'd prefer to. Perhaps there aren't any other suitable jobs available, or they believe they wouldn't get another equivalent job, or there may be personal reasons which tie them to the particular job that they currently have. In their model, Bourne and Bourne suggest that people will fall into one of four categories. There'll be the change agents, and these are the people who like change. The people in this group will see the change as an opportunity. They'll actively engage really quickly, and they can be very helpful in persuading others. However, it can be hard for the people in this group to understand why others don't react in the same way. Bystanders, they'll be positively inclined towards the change, and they're likely to accept it, but it may be in the form of compliance rather than in overt enthusiasm. And it may take a little persuading. The traditionalists, this group will see the change as a threat, and they will passively resist. And that may take the form of avoiding it or ignoring what's required to make the change happen. Again, they will take persuading. And then we have the resistors. And these are the people who will see the change clearly as a threat and will actively resist it. But they may not always do so openly. Behaviours in this group might include arguing, obstructing, undermining, or even sabotaging. Having said all of that, resistance shouldn't be viewed as something inherently bad or as a sign of failure. Whether traditionalists or resistors, these people may have very valid points of view that you need to hear. And resistance, viewed in the right way, is actually a resource for a leader. Because if you're prepared to listen and actively engage with the concerns, it may actually make the change more likely to happen. By seeking to understand why people resist, you can identify very real issues which could impact the change, but perhaps haven't been recognised by those who designed it or who are leading the change. The perspective at the front line can be very different to that at the top of the organisation. So Mora suggests that there are three key reasons for resistance. I don't get it. I just don't understand. I don't see why we need to change. Now, this can be due to a lack of information, or it can be because the information shared is not convincing. Perhaps their data shows something different to the data that you are using. Perhaps they don't have the whole picture. It's very easy to forget that if you're a leader in an organisation at whatever level, you have more of a picture of what goes on across the whole piece than somebody who is on the front line. And it can also be due to a disagreement over what really matters, over values. I don't like it. This change is a real threat to me, or those I care about. It'll cause me or them to lose money, maybe status, face, control, or maybe even jobs. Alternatively, it will create a lot of extra work for me or my team over time for an end goal that I don't actually value, or I'm not sure that we have the skills and competencies needed to do. This type of resistance to change is likely to be felt very deeply and is often not openly expressed. Both I don't understand it and I don't like it need to be addressed through sharing of a lot of information in multiple ways and via multiple channels. And the information needs to fit the audience so people do understand why the change is necessary, what their role in it is, and what its impact will be. Really important is to identify and emphasize benefits for individuals. You may have a clear picture of what the benefit is for the organization, but what's going to be the benefit for the person working in that organization? What's it going to mean for them? Remember, you're pushing them out of their comfort zone. And it is really important that these are real benefits that the individual actually values. Engage them in the process. If they have an influence over it, they are more likely to want it to succeed and to understand it. But above all, be honest. If there are downsides, be honest about the downsides, because they'll have worked them out already. And this takes us into I don't like you or those you represent. And this is about a lack of trust and doubts about the capability of those who are leading the change. And previous experience can have a strong influence here, as do past resentments. Responses to this need to acknowledge and accept previous failings up front. There's no point pretending they don't exist, because you all know that they do. It's the white elephant in the room. Build trust by doing what you have said you will do. Deliver. Show that you can be trusted. And actively consider ideas suggested by those who are resisting. You don't have to take them on board, but be seen to be listening and responding. Again, it's about building up that relationship. The key point to be made here is that it's important that people don't pretend they're okay with change if they're not. Fears and concerns need to be out in the open so that you can deal with them, you can respond to them. You need to understand what it is about the change that they see as most challenging or frightening so that you can address it. Recognizing people's feelings are genuine, it's important as engaging them to work through the issues. Give them the space, value and accept their feelings, listen to what they have to tell you. It could save you making mistakes further down the line. Open and honest individual conversation about people's attitudes and fears can only happen in an environment of trust between the individual and the manager. So you need to consider this. If people are concerned for their jobs or their future, it can be very difficult for them to open up and discuss these things with you. What I've put up here is an example of a bottom-up model, and it's intended to reflect how an individual might travel through a change process and highlight the activities, the actions which are important. It puts the focus firmly on employees with the intention of limiting resistance and speeding up implementation. It's a 5-part model about involving people right from the beginning. So it starts with increasing the awareness of the need for change and creating a desire for the change based on how they'll benefit from it. This is really important. If you're not clear about what the change is going to do for the organization and the people within it, you're going to find this very difficult in terms of actually convincing others. So it's really important that you are clear about why the change is needed, what it's going to achieve. People need to understand how the change can be made to happen. So this can be about the processes, the necessary training involved, the changes that need to be made. And again, it's really important that you are clear about this and you share. Ability refers to ensuring that employees have the necessary skills and competencies. By providing the necessary training and development, ensuring people are in the right place with the right competencies, it gives people confidence that the change can be achieved and that they have a place in it. And reinforcement happens post the change and includes the reward and recognition that will sustain the change and keep it in place. Having put in all of the effort to reach the change, you don't want to let it slip. This model recognises that organisational change and individual change are linked. They're clearly linked and interdependent, in fact. But individuals will move through this process at different times and at different speeds. So the idea here is to focus on helping the employee move through the change process successfully. So whether people accept or resist change, we do need to be aware that any response often will involve emotion. So the change transition curve, which I'm showing here, is based upon Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 1960s model, which she originally created to show the stages of the grieving process. The model's been adapted over the years and is today commonly cited as a means of explaining the emotional stages employees experience during a period of organisational change. It typically follows a course of 6 distinct phases, and the curve represents the time taken for employees to pass through each stage. So it starts with shock, and this may be disbelief in terms of the change being necessary, and people not actually realising that they need to move out of their comfort zone. It may be short-lived, but it is characterised by a sharp decline in performance and motivation. People then move into denial. Change isn't really necessary. We've always done it like this and it works. But as we've already observed, this may be because they're feeling threatened by the change. So there'll continue to be a decline in performance as a loss of direction is felt. That can then lead to anger, where feelings of unfairness and injustice can be experienced. And the anger may be directed inwards as well as outwards, with the individual blaming themselves that somehow they weren't good enough, what they do isn't right, the team they're part of obviously isn't delivering as the organisation needs, or outwards to the wider organisation, feeling that either the changes are necessary, or the change is too big, or that the organisation should have in some way preempted the change. After this, depression begins to sink in, and this represents the lowest point for the employee in terms of morale and performance. So up until this point, basically, we're seeing morale and performance decline. Not for everybody, but for a number of people in the organisation. People then begin to accept and begin to rise back up the curve, improving their performance and their morale and their motivation. Employers begin to accept that change is inevitable, and they strive to work with it rather than against it. They adapt to new ways, integrate it, and work with renewed energy and enthusiasm. Now, clearly, this is a model, and people will react differently to change, and they may feel some or all of these emotions, and they may feel some or all of them in this order. Even the enthusiasts can go through this. But it's also important to notice, or to note, that people can get stuck at any stage. This can be a useful tool in terms of prompting you to consider the negative consequences of change, such as a decline in motivational performance or engagement. And this enables you to respond to the anticipated problems proactively before they actually happen. But it does have to be managed, and it requires some resilience on your part as the leader. It's part of the management of the risk management process of change. But you should also note that change can have an effect on you as the leader, and your responses to change may well reflect some of this curve. And recognizing this helps you to prepare yourself for the change and manage yourself and your personal resilience. And this is key for a successful process. I recently heard Professor Anand Narasimhan of the Swiss Business School IMD speaking about leadership in a crisis. And he suggested that qualities relating to compassion, notably sympathy for others, a wish to help them move forward, was something which had been rare at the top of organisations before the COVID-19 crisis. But he felt these capabilities, these aspects of leadership were now coming to the fore. And it seems to me that these qualities are very relevant for leading change successfully. So, to summarise, leading change is not easy, but it is a necessary activity for any leader within an organisation. The models and theories all have limitations, but they can help you to navigate through change if they're used sensibly. The size and the nature of the change determines the type of change management needed. So I would say to you, consider using multiple models to create your change framework for your unique situation. So bringing it all together in the 5 M's of leading change, if you will, you need to recognise that people need to feel valued and to be engaged in the process. They need to have their efforts and achievements recognised and to be developed and challenged as part of change. It's so important to have clearly explained reasons for the change and the benefits that are going to be of value to those who you need to support the change. Communication can't be stressed too heavily. It's crucial throughout the process to keep people involved, to keep them committed to the change. And if there's one thing I would stress, it is that communicate to all involved and all of the time. There cannot be too much communication of the why we need to do this. Don't fear resistance. Embrace it as something potentially helpful. It's a means of identifying gaps. Sorry, excuse me. It's a means of identifying gaps in your plans, and it can warn you that things are not working as expected. Even if you're a natural embracer of change, recognize that most people aren't. Keep people engaged. Share information continually. Celebrate success along the way, however small. This helps to renew people's sense of purpose and enthusiasm and gives them confidence that the change can actually be achieved. Measure the results of your change process and the impact of the change itself. This should be planned from the beginning, so appropriate data can be collected along the way. So often I've seen organisations get almost to the end of a change process and they say, okay, so how are we going to show that this is successful? How are we going to measure this? Too late. You have to be collecting data from the beginning. Share progress, share the good, share the bad. It's important to be honest. People aren't expecting change to be trouble-free, and the chances are they already know where their issues are. They're probably on the receiving end of them. A lot of the received wisdom about change implies it's either a success or a failure. But I would suggest that in reality, it's a graded scale. It can be a full or partial success. And fifth, not least, if you do all of these things, it will help you make change happen. So, having said all of that, I would now like to move on to inviting Euan Blair to share with us his perspective as a CEO of an organisation who has been through change, does live in turbulent times. I have a series of questions I'm going to use to prompt Euan, but I'm sure he's got lots of interesting things to say. So, Euan.
Hey, hi Denise.
Yeah, okay. Right, can you begin by telling us from your experience as a CEO leading change in your own workplace and company, what do you think are the most important leadership characteristics in creating and leading change successfully?
Sure. So I don't have 5 M's as you shared before, but I can.
You can borrow them. I don't mind.
That's very kind. There's certainly some overlap there. I'll give my thoughts on some of the things I think are important. And actually, you touched on it earlier, but empathy is absolutely essential, and it's probably been underemphasized when people talk about management, leadership, and change. And it's particularly important in moments like this, in terms of what we're going through at the moment. It's important actually when implementing any sort of change, because some people are always going to find change more challenging than others. And if you take us as an example, as we've scaled, lots of our team are taking on increasing amounts of responsibility. Lots of them are developing into managers and leaders in their own right. But in some areas, we've brought in individuals at a senior level to manage people who were previously used to running their own function entirely. And that can be really tough for those people. Part of it's a natural consequence of scale, but a lot of it's actually the shift that growing companies make from this team of generalists to a much more narrowly defined team of specialists. Because at the start, you rely on most of your team to be generalists, because everyone's going to get involved in multiple areas. But as functions grow, and your organization becomes increasingly sophisticated, you've got to bring in increased levels of expertise. And we spend a lot of time encouraging people to be comfortable giving away their Legos. And it's a phrase popularized by Molly Graham, who was at Facebook and Google. And essentially, people who were hugely energized when they had 10 different jobs to do in lots of different areas of responsibility end up needing to adapt to having a much more discrete role. And often anxiety can come in because it's natural for people to worry this is going to limit their progression or their significance. And some people will never be comfortable with this. And ultimately, they're the people who won't scale as the organization does. You've got to deal with them in a truly empathetic way. I think the second thing is you've got to bring people with you. And again, you touched on some of this. The best way of doing that is to be as transparent as possible. We share detailed financials every quarter with the whole team. key metrics, benchmarking performance across each business unit. We feed back on our board meetings. We do 360 reviews twice a year. And it doesn't guarantee that when you share certain messages, they'll be well received, but it certainly makes it easier to bring people with you as things are changing. If you're consistently upfront and actually you're prepared to rationalize the actions you're taking. Now, it's not the same as disintermediating yourself from making the decision. You've got to be prepared to clearly articulate why you've taken those steps. It's the best way of ensuring alignment in an organization, both on an individual level, but also so you can hit those kind of organizational goals. And I think the final thing is you've got to be able to articulate your vision clearly and ensure everyone has a well-defined sense of where you're going and what you're trying to achieve. And if you can break that down into a series of staging posts, that's incredibly helpful, right? It's like a marathon made up of a series of sprints. And our vision is to build an outstanding alternative to university. But there's clearly lots to unpack in that. So we've spent a lot of time ensuring our team understand exactly what that means for each area of our business, and how their goals fulfill that vision. Because in a time of rapid change, it's really important you don't lose sight of the North Star, and that even as you need to adapt or pivot your business model in the wider context you're faced with, you can still articulate that effectively to people.
Yes, thanks for that, Euan. Absolutely agree. And I think the breaking the marathon into small reachable stages is really important in terms of giving people confidence to achieve it. And this is how you can get your small wins out there and demonstrate to people that it is doable. So I think that's a really important point. So as we move beyond the immediate challenges thrown at businesses in the light of the COVID crisis, how do you think that leaders can adapt to keep businesses moving forward and remain effective?
So a few ways. I think it's just worth saying on the crisis at the moment. I mean, this is a global crisis unprecedented since the Second World War. And unlike a lot of things that have come before, it's not regionally contained. It's affecting every part of society and economic orthodoxies. And then in amongst all of that, it's actually a threat to human life. So it's sent everything into flux, and it's impacting equally governments, businesses, and citizens. And, you know, take as an example what we're doing now. Everyone's had to overnight become fully remote and completely change their behaviors. And in those circumstances, there are some companies where the immediate future looks almost impossible to navigate. Let's say you're a provider of office space or a travel or tourism company. There are massive, massive existential challenges there. But for a lot of companies, there are plenty of ways they can continue to be successful, even if they've got to make significant changes to their core business model. And as a leader, and when you're navigating change that is at this level and is constantly on everyone's mind, you can characterize it. It's a bit like when you're on an airplane and there's that constant hum of background noise, and most of the time you tune it out and you don't really notice it. But actually, the minute you start to think about it, you hear it, and it's actually quite loud and jarring. You've got to move people beyond that, because crisis will always present as many opportunities as challenges. And if as a leader, you're spending your entire time simply firefighting, then it's very difficult to ever find a way to just move beyond those challenges. And we don't know how long this will last. I think anyone expecting a return to normal anytime soon is kidding themselves. A vaccine could take 2 years, but every leader in a business right now needs to be focused on how to succeed in the COVID world, and not actually spending a great deal of time thinking too much about what comes next, because it's incumbent on us all to focus on what's right in front of us, focus on the immediate, and not let yourself get distracted from that. And the really exciting thing when it comes to change is we actually have permission to experiment in nearly every area, because you can try things that won't work or might have limited success, and your customers or your users or employees won't blame you, because they can see that you're trying and they know the same boat. You've got to focus on new routes to market, for example, or new revenue opportunities, and that could allow you to spur growth. It's worth remembering companies like Airbnb and Groupon scaled in the teeth of the financial crisis, and there'll be a series of companies this time around that do the same thing. What you won't be forgiven for, though, rightly, is inaction or complaining that the things you want to do are too hard because of the current situation. And for anyone, I think, in any sort of role, in a leadership role in the company right now, they've got to be excited about the possibilities that exist for real innovation. One of our values is we are all change makers, and there's no better time to live that principle. And I think the final thing I'll say on this is moments like these often help leaders clarify what's really important. Ben Horowitz wrote a brilliant blog of Andreessen Horowitz on wartime CEO, peacetime CEO. And the way in which you respond and act and the speed with which you do that and how you do it are incredibly important right now. And you cannot be doing simply the things you were doing before. And while large companies have some advantages in these circumstances, economies of scale, strong balance sheets, lots of resources, actually smaller organizations and startups can pivot their models much quicker to meet these challenges. And you're probably finding more and more large organizations trying to act like smaller ones at the moment to respond to the aftermath of the crisis.
Thanks. Thanks, Euan. Yeah, I think the point about tolerance is a great one. I think at the moment there is a great deal of tolerance in terms of changing the way things happen and changing the way that you approach things that perhaps isn't normally there.
Yeah, your resistors in your point before
are
really quite minimalized at the moment.
It's easy. And in some ways, it's easy to create the vision of why you need to do things and why you need to change. But of course, that's probably going to be time limited. People will become, to some extent, used to the situation, and then expectations may change. So you referred to a blog, but referring to your own blog in relation to COVID lockdown, you said that you have said, and you said a little bit about it just now, that the workplace won't be the same after this. So what do you think are going to be the biggest challenges for businesses after COVID? And how can leaders preempt and respond to keep ahead of the competition? Can you just sort of explain that a little bit more than you already have?
Absolutely. I think probably the most critical, and it won't surprise you to hear me say this, is keeping your employees motivated and engaged while having to work from home for the foreseeable future, and then actually managing the transition back to the office. One thing we're finding with remote working at the moment is when everyone's remote, it is brilliant, actually. And while there's some latency and there are some issues, people aren't feeling left out or left behind because everyone's in the same boat. As you start to transition back, there then does become friction between those who are working in the office and those who aren't, and how you keep on this kind of half remote, half non-remote system alive and keep it working functionally. Because lots of employees won't want to return to office working. And regardless of whether the government says it's safe to do so, many of them will resist. And businesses will fail if they think they can simply go back to normal. I think the other thing is solving digital skills gaps will be critical. We've witnessed through this the acceleration of the internet, where before we had video conferencing as an example, but it wasn't necessarily widely used. People were still traveling, face-to-face meetings were still the norm. That will change after this. And it was already going to be one of the biggest workforce challenges of the 2020s, but it's even more significant now. I think a remote-first environment will be devastating for any business that can't effectively digitalize its offer. And that's going to require a lot of reskilling of existing employees. We think apprenticeships will be relied upon as a vital way of doing this. And it's no surprise that our fastest growing program right now is data analytics, because these skills have become existential for all businesses. And in a time of shrinking discretionary spend, actually using the apprenticeship levy has become a bigger priority for a lot of businesses. The other thing is getting hiring right, and the market for talent and judging that effectively will look quite different. There are a small number of businesses continuing to hire at the moment, and they will be the ones in the strongest position, not just because they can afford to do that, but they're getting some incredible talent and they're continuing to build businesses even in these moments. If you look at the last financial crisis, about 10% of companies emerged in a much stronger position and grew through the crisis. And part of that was making smart decisions about which areas to scale back and which areas to be hiring in. And then finally, ensuring transparency, and you talked about compassion before, when making business decisions, will have a really positive impact on your ability to retain customers and employees. People have long memories, and while you'll be forgiven for trying things that go wrong, you won't be forgiven for giving up or failing to adapt.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think as well, you won't be forgiven if you apparently don't appreciate the impact it's having on other people, whether you fail or succeed. I think that's a key thing. So if you're going to summarize that, Euan, where do you think, or what do you think business leaders need to address over the next few months? What would be your top three, if you will, of things you think they need to address?
I think probably the biggest will be the crisis stretching on longer than anticipated. So, for example, anyone holding off on making decisions until September, October, when things might return to normal, is at risk of making a huge mistake. We still know so little about how COVID works. It's not a surprise. Most US-based tech companies have told their employees not to expect to be back in the office until March 21. If you're looking for normalcy to return in the short to medium term, you're going to get caught on the wrong side of how you can emerge from this. I think the other thing is leaders will have to revisit decisions made at the outset of this crisis that made sense at the time and continue to review them and be prepared to update their guidance, their core operating model, the kind of internal structures they've set up, and managing the transition will be really, really important. And actually what it means long-term for how your business has changed. And then businesses will need to have a different relationship with their clients because they'll be working with customers and suppliers who may no longer exist once we come out of this, or at least will exist in a very different manner. Empathy there, as with the leadership principle with your employees, is important, but also you need to figure out how to engage in those constructive conversations where you're both acknowledging that the world is a pretty worrying place right now, and we all need to navigate it.
Brilliant, thank you. So that's given us a great outline of your view, and I'm sure that the people who are listening to this have got lots of questions they want to ask both of us. So I'm now going to hand over to Natasha and say it's time for people to ask questions of us.
Thank you very much, Denise. We have had a lot of questions submitted prior to this session, so we're just going to cover a few of them and then we'll move over to questions that have been submitted through the live comments. It's great to see so many people interacting and giving each other advice. So I just want to say, first of all, that this is, our advice to you. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So please do take away some learnings and see what you can put into practice. So Tom Leadham has asked, things can quickly change direction. How do you keep the team's energy up whilst this happens? It can be quite exhausting when the work you have done is suddenly scrapped and you need to start again.
Okay, I'll take this first and then perhaps hand over to Euan for his view. But yeah, absolutely. If you've done a lot of work on something, you've worked really hard, it's not only exhausting, it can be quite demotivating if it then gets scrapped and you have to start again. I think I would look at it in two ways. Firstly, the transparency angle. If you know that this is a possibility, if you know that this could happen, then be upfront about it. Say we're going to do this, but we're trying it. It may not work. It may not fit, whatever. And, it's a learning process. So although you may have to scrap what you've done, you don't necessarily lose everything because you've learnt while you've done it. And then you can recycle what you've learnt into improving what you do next. So I think you can use what's happened to keep the motivation there and to make a useful tool, if you will, out of the experience and exercise that you've done to take into the next thing you're asked to do and do it better, improve it, do it so it fits. But I think that's something that we all need to be engaged in. So get the team to do that, get everybody has a share in this. So get everybody to identify what can be taken out of it that's positive and use that to re-energize. Euan, what's your view?
Yeah, I fully agree. And actually maintaining that level of positivity is essential. And it's got to come from the leader and radiate throughout the organization. I think the best bit of advice I'd give is just complete candor. Because if you are upfront with people, but we don't have all the answers, we don't yet know exactly what this is going to look like or how long it's going to go on for. And really, really valuable things that mean a lot to those people and they put a lot of time and energy into may be scrapped or cease to exist, or you'll have to take radical change in their area. At least if you're candid about it, they'll get that. And maybe the thing that makes this slightly easier in like the current situation is because everyone is going through the same thing and it is affecting everyone. It's much easier for people to get that on an instinctive level.
I think that's right. And can I just add, I think with any change, we're in a very particular situation now, but in any change, to a certain extent, where you'll end up is unknown. You know where you want to end up, you know where you intend to end up, but you won't know you actually end up there till you get there. And almost all change requires change as you go along.
Yeah, as a leader, you're pretending you've got all the answers right now as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And quickly.
Yeah, I mean, as a leader, we never have all the right answers. We don't know, and it's crazy to pretend that we do. Thanks for that, Tom. That was a good question.
And Zoe's asked, now that we've settled into remote working, how do you encourage staff members to contribute to change? So lots of their usual methods are office-based.
Yeah, and I think that's probably something that companies everywhere are experiencing. And I think it's about starting to think about how we do things differently. And we're all on that journey. We're all on that path. There are lots of tools that you can use digitally to create shared spaces, whiteboards, all sorts of mechanisms for people to actually contribute, but in different ways. And in some ways, what we've got to do is go back to blank sheet of paper in terms of how we engage people and look at different ways of doing it. Because if we start from our old assumptions, we're just going to hit snags. What we need to say is, okay, what creatively are the different ways, the new ways that are now available to us that people can get involved with and can contribute? So there are lots and lots of tools, way too many tools for me to list, and way more tools than I know about out there that you can use. But I think time is well spent in exploring some of the options and then try and introduce people to engaging in different ways, but nevertheless making sure their voice can be heard. And that is just so important. People's voice has to be heard. Euan.
Yeah, I think where you can formalize it and actually make it part of your regular team meetings to open up the discussion on ideas around change, that's essential. And more than ever, it's worth kind of being very clear that we're in a period where best idea wins, and that should be the case anyway. But it's worth reiterating that if someone has a brilliant idea about how to make people feel more engaged or motivated, bring it to the table. I mean, I'll give you an example. We've had a number of the team, and people weren't being too upfront about it at first, feel physically and mentally exhausted through being on video conferences the whole time and constantly having that performative aspect of being on video to deal with. And so we found very quickly that actually asking people to do one-to-ones and other conversations while taking a walk in the park on the phone and actually switching off video for a bit was really, really helpful, just to allow people to recharge and reset, and making it clear that that was an option that anyone in the company could take if they wanted to, because otherwise it's just going to be, people are going to find it really, really difficult to manage over a long period of time.
Thanks, Zoe. That was a great question as well. Lots of people struggling with that at the moment, I think.
That's great. So Sammy Penny over on LinkedIn has said, what ways can you engage teams you are managing? So I know virtually this has been quite difficult for some organisations to achieve.
Again, I think a bit of creativity and lateral thinking come in here. I know, for example, of teams where every Friday they have a cocktail hour, and they literally just come onto the screen in a group, whether it's through Microsoft Teams or Zoom or Hangouts or whatever they use, and they literally have a social hour. Well, it doesn't have to be a cocktail, it can be a cup of tea, doesn't matter. But they literally have half an hour. They don't necessarily talk about work, but they just hang out. Which is really what they would do in the office around, the water cooler or the teapot or whatever it is. So it's just moving that into a different way online. So I'm certainly aware that happens, and people are saying that works very positively. But I think one of the things to do is to make sure that there are regular touch-in points, which are not just about work. They're about the other things that matter to people when they're at work. And whether it's on a one-to-one basis or in a group basis, I think it's really important that people are still feeling engaged, and that just still feels that the work team that they're part of is real and cares about them, and it matters to them what's happening in their lives as they cope with the situation that they're currently in. So I think it's about making those spaces, and I'm sure there's lots of creative ways people have been doing this, but it can be quite simple. It can simply be that cocktail hour, that meet for tea and a chat, that whatever you want to call it. It can be as simple as that, but it needs to happen. It needs to happen regularly. Euan.
Yeah, and I think some teams will find different ways of doing it. A lot of our teams operate daily stand-ups where people can feel more engaged in the actual management process and understand where they're up to in terms of the project they're working on. I think one thing it's really important to encourage is more unstructured conversations. So not with an agenda, not with formalized time, but just the kind of thing that happens in an office where you walk past someone's desk and that brief conversation actually sparks an idea or a thought, because otherwise that gets shut down, and it's really important we don't lose that as we're in a pattern of long-term remote working. And I think any way as a leader you can just give more people chances to ask you questions. I've started doing weekly office hours where I'll stay on a Zoom call every week for an hour, and just anyone who wants to drop on and ask any question about WhiteHat or the company or just anything in general can go and do that. And it's a good way of making people feel more connected to some of the stuff that you're working on, and just also gives them more forums. People need that right now.
I think those are great suggestions. Thanks, Euan.
So we have had this one's cropped up a few times. Some people disagree that we can't have too much communication. It can get quite bogged down with all of the messages that are coming at us. It can be quite overwhelming. So do you agree with that? Do you think that we do need to take a measured approach to communicating, or we should just tell people things as we know them?
I think that's a fair point, and I certainly wouldn't advocate communicating just for the sake of communicating. I think it's important that when you communicate, the message has purpose and meaning, and that it's suitable for its audience. And I think we do have to be aware that particularly when we're working digitally, it's easy to overwhelm people. So I take that as a very fair point. But what I wanted to stress that you can't just communicate at the beginning or partway through a change and think that that is sufficient. It's important that people are engaged and aware and being told things. If you don't tell people things, if you don't tell them how it's progressing, they will step in and fill the vacuum. So if you don't share any information and there's no clear outline of where people are, they'll begin to imagine where they are, and they'll begin to imagine what's happening. And that's how gossip starts and rumors start, and how people start to feel demotivated because they don't actually have a really clear, accurate understanding of where the organization is and the changes. So I absolutely take the point, particularly in current times, it's easy to be overwhelmed. But I think if you're nuanced in your communication, you're focused in your communication, and it's meaningful, people will always put that top of the pile. They'll look at it. It's only when your communication doesn't meet those criteria and they begin to think it's just full of waffle, it slips down the pile and it doesn't get read. Or it gets, straight in B1N before anybody's even opened the email. So I think it is about being nuanced and focused, but it's got to be communicated the whole way through. One of the reasons change frequently fails or isn't as successful as hoped is because people didn't communicate enough at the right times and with the right messages that people could actually understand and buy into. And it's one of the biggest challenges, I think. Euan, what would your view be?
You definitely can over communicate for sure, and it's something that adds to this kind of the level of fatigue people are feeling can stem from that for sure. I think so. Purposeful communication is obviously important, as you mentioned. I think the other thing is it's more the type and nature of the communication. Now, I'm not sure it's a good principle anyway, but certainly in peacetime conditions, you don't necessarily have to share as much or be as forthcoming about the decisions you're taking and what you're doing. In wartime conditions, which we're absolutely in the thick of this COVID crisis, you have to be more explicit than ever about the purpose of what you're doing and why you're taking the decisions you're taking. And there's a nuance there between over communicating, actually just the quality of communication you're giving and the transparency of communication.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's quality and transparency. I think those are the key things.
That's great, thank you. We are coming towards the end of today's session, so that is the last question we can take. But thank you to everyone who's joined us and participated today. There's been lots of discussions across both LinkedIn and YouTube. Thank you, Denise, and thank you, Euan, for sharing your insights and expertise. It's been great to have you.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for the invite.
If you are a member of the CMI, you can access Management Direct, which has a whole range of practical resources to help you apply your learnings from today. If you're new to CMI, or if you haven't heard of Management Direct, it's full of personal and professional development opportunities, including over 400 videos, 5,000 ebooks, and much more. You can get 10% off your first year's membership to CMI by joining by the 31st of May and using the code PB10. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Have
Thanks,
a great
everybody.
day, everyone. Stay safe.
Have a good day. Bye.